Unions and employers are at loggerheads over calls to overhaul the country's employee bargaining system.
Do you have support, as far as you know, from industry or business groups for this kind of reform?
I think some will support, I think some will absolutely oppose, and that's unfortunate, but it's really not surprising.
It is a recipe for disaster, and in the end it would cost jobs, no doubt about it.
The language of the national discussion about workplace relations has been rapidly changing over the past week, and so has the tone of that discussion.
A breakthrough this morning for the Albanese government. Small business and the union movement have struck a groundbreaking agreement.
The devil is in the detail, and we're going to create that detail. You cannot get industrial relations reform in this country to stick if business and unions don't come together and find some middle ground, and that's what we'll be doing at the summit.
Even 4 days before the Albanese government's job summit, the shift in the nature of the national conversation about wage bargaining and consensus revealed today must have been encouraging to the Prime Minister. Today marks 100 days in office, and in a speech to the National Press Club to mark this milestone, Anthony Albanese was as keen to talk about the way he wanted the country to conduct politics as he was to talk about what has been or can be achieved.
And the way that we do that, the how, matters as well. I know there's a school of political thought that views cooperation as capitulation, consensus as weakness, but Australians have conflict fatigue. These aren't abstract problems. Australians are paying a real price.
The past decade has been dominated by a political modus operandi in which many issues have been dealt with as daily political problems. That is, either shut them down or shunt them off, but not let them run for too long lest they get out of control. This Prime Minister, by comparison, seems happy to let issues bubble away in the community.
Governing can't just be an exercise in getting through to the end of the day, to the other side of the story, or even to the next election. Governments foster a culture of reform and progress and cooperation, nourish a spirit of shared effort for fair reward.
The question of the voice for Indigenous Australians is a classic example. The lack of detail about the government's proposal is already the subject of criticism in some quarters, as was the PM's decision on the weekend to have American basketball legend Shaquille O'Neal appear to announce he would be promoting the voice in social videos.
We're at DJing.
But the PM doesn't want to make it an upfront government proposal, rather one which has already been the subject of considerable and intense community debate. Similarly, whatever the criticisms of Shaquille O'Neal's role, Albanese has told colleagues that having someone with 16 million Twitter followers, including a huge cohort of young people in Australia who may have no idea what The Voice is about, makes having him on board completely worthwhile.
If your priority is scoring day-to-day political points, then the future loses out.
100 days ago, the big question was whether Anthony Albanese's so-called small target strategy would leave him enough room to manoeuvre. And in an era of $80 billion budget deficits, there is perhaps no bigger constraint on him than the so-called Stage 3 tax cuts, which are forecast to cost a staggering $15.7 billion in their first year, from July 2024, and $184.2 billion in the first 7 years. Today, the PM appeared to reiterate that the tax cuts were not negotiable.
I said at the time that it wasn't wise to consider that you knew in 2019 exactly what the economy would look like in 2024-25. But the Parliament made a decision to vote against the package, would have been voting against tax cuts, including for people who desperately needed it at the time.
For those paying close attention, there is room for manoeuvre in these remarks. Note how the PM framed Labor's position in terms of support for those tax cuts at the time as being necessary to ensure other cuts got through. And then there was this.
Of course we face real challenges. That's a reality of the fiscal position that we inherited of $1 trillion of debt.
Calls for the government to abandon the tax cuts have been growing, including in the Parliament, because of their astronomical cost and the pressing need for spending on everything from the NDIS to defence. Those calls represent a classic example of how sometimes waiting for public opinion to shift actually creates space in which the government can reposition. The tax cuts are likely to form part of the conversation at this week's Job Summit.
I know that when we wrap up on Friday afternoon, there will still be $1 trillion of debt. Australian families will still be struggling with the cost of living pressures. Businesses, big and small, will still need help with staff and skills. But for the first time in a long time, I believe we will be moving to agreement on how to solve these problems rather than arguing over who is to blame for them.